In the other videos, we've talked about how we can utilize positive reinforcement to reward the dogs for the behaviors that we want from them. In this video, I want to talk about the flip side of that, because sometimes we're going to have to disagree with our dogs. Now, most people use the word no to disagree. Is that what you guys generally do when the dog's doing something you don't want? Or okay. So we can use any sound we want. Is not a default sound that they hear on their own. So we can use but we have to brand it, which means marking it or using it with perfect timing a good 200 or more times in a row. And most people just do not have the capacity to be that precise. Instead of using the word no, I use a hissing sound like a cat. I use that for two reasons. Reason number one is because they know who we're talking to. Don't hiss at your husband. It does not work on husbands. I know it doesn't work on wives. Might work on kids. The other reason I like using is there's a UCLA study that shows children the age of 4 hear the word no over 400 times a day. And so it is used so often. Dogs have something called learned irrelevance. If a word is used in conjunction or around them enough where it's not for them, after a while they just stop listening for it because it's never for me. A study that I read with dogs showed that the word no was directed at the dog 16 to 24% of the time in a home with children and a dog on average. So that means 76% of the time it's not towards them. So what I do is I use a hissing sound like a cat one time per incident. If I go hiss, 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 it becomes like a no. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I do is I hiss, and I have 10 versions of a hiss. I have a level 1 hiss, like a tss, and level 10. And can you see him in the video? Mm-hmm. I have a level 10 hiss, which is more like this. Did he stop? So you see, it can change. You know, he even dropped it and walked away. Now I wasn't even looking at him. Now, I like using the hissing sound because cats, snakes, skunks, cougars, mountain lions, even bunny rabbits make a hissing sound. Mm-hmm. I get some people who are very passionate in the dog world. They get very angry with me because the dog whisperer he wants dogs to be calm, submissive, which is not what I believe in. He uses dominance theory, which he's very physical with dogs. I don't do any of those things. One thing he does do is he uses a hissing sound, which is appropriate. But a lot of people hear that and think, well, you're just like Caesar Milan. All right. So basically, the hissing sound, I only want to use one time per incident. If I use it over and over and over again, then it becomes, like I said, watered down. So the first thing I do is I hiss. Second thing I do is I abruptly stand up. To a dog, this is the I mean business position. My authority goes whatever direction my hips are pointed at. Right now, my authority is pointed here. If the dog was right here and then walked over here, no, you don't just stay on me. If the dog walks over here and I continue to face here, the dog literally walked away from my authority. So as the dog walks away, I pivot and I keep the dog in front of me. Now, a dog, when I stand up, I stand up abruptly. A half of dog communication is through movement. The other half of the time, there's meandering around. When they communicate through movement, it's a big, bold, sudden movement. So there's a difference between if I get up like this, not much of a reaction from the dogs. Where if I get up more like, the dogs usually will take a step back. Mm-hmm. Now when they move away, they're checking, is he talking to me? So if they move away and I don't track them, then they think, well, he just stood up suddenly, he got stung in the butt by a bee, or it wasn't related to me. So I keep my hips pointed at the dog and I keep tracking the dog until the dog is stationary. As soon as the dog is stationary, stop, it can stand in place, it can sit or it can lie down. Then I would sit back down or step backwards. That's my second consequence, standing up and turning to face the dog and pivoting to keep the dog in front of me until it's stationary. The other option, it could stand, sit, or lie down, or it could leave the room completely if it has that authority or authorization. The third consequence that I use is I march at the dog. Now, when I say march, most people think I mean stomping. I don't mean stomping. I'm moving briskly, horizontally towards the dog. You want to give the dog a flinching experience. So if you walk to the dog casually, the dog just stands there. So when you walk, you need to be walking suddenly at the dog, and you go, if the dog moves, you move towards wherever the dog is. The dog needs to think, if I don't get out of the way, they're running me over. Now with our Boston, we have to be a little bit more careful. She's got some eye visibility issues, and she's a smaller dog. Gavin is a big dog. So if he's still there, we don't slow down, we walk through him. Mm-hmm. Deferring is a good follower mindset to have. We want the dog, instead of, if we're going to get up and the dog's in front of us, if we get up and walk around the dog, that tells the dog, yeah, you're the important one. So just walk through. The dog needs to get out of your way. Now, if the dog's asleep, you can be nice and step around the dog. But if the dog is standing in your way, just walk through it. eventually the dog will start seeing you coming and moving away on its own. So when I march towards the dog, I'm marching very briskly. I do not slow down as I approach the dog. And I keep on marching toward the dog until it does something specific. Now I'm going to shift over here. So if and here I'll give you that, buddy. I just got him to stop. All right, so if I'm the dog and you stand up and you're marching me using the third consequence, and I back up like this, but I back up a mile, but if I'm still facing you, I'm still challenging. As a dog, if I want to communicate, I understand what you're saying, I'm going to do this. I turn sideways or greater. So as soon as the dog turns sideways, you stop. Almost freeze. Now this looks indecisive if you see my feet apart. So I want my feet together. And now my hips are going to be pointed at the dog, and then I revert to the second consequence, and then I keep pivoting until the dog is stationary. Once it's stationary, then I can either take a step backwards or I can sit down. But if, let's say that there's a boundary. Let's say that there's a line right here, and I'm not allowed to be as a dog in this carpeted area because somebody's eating here. So you stand up and march at me, I turn sideways here. Well, the boundary is still here. I'm still not supposed to be here. So you would continue marching at me. Once I cross this threshold, then you would stop. And then if I walk over here, you pivot. If I walk over here, you pivot. And then when I sit down or I'm stationary, then you can sit back down. Now, if I'm doing this, let's say I'm establishing the boundary here, the dog's over here. I march the dog across the boundary. As soon as it gets across the boundary, I stop. Take my step back. Now, if I go like this and go back to the kitchen, my authority is pointing here. The dog has already communicated it wants to come into the kitchen across the boundary. So in this case, once the dog is stationary, I take a step backwards. And I pause a half second to read the dog. If the dog stays stationary, take another step backwards. Let's say when I step backwards, the dog started coming forward. I rush towards the dog. Now in that case, I'm combining three consequences. I'm hissing, rushing towards the dog simultaneously, two consequences. So we want to make sure that the dog, and again, it needs to be a sharp, sudden movement. The dog needs to think, ooh, I'm going to get out of here. Now, a lot of people, if the dog's right here, they're like, I told you not to do that. Well, I just took away half of my authority. Stand up. Keep your shoulders back and your chin up, good posture. And keep your authority pointing at the dog. The fourth consequence that I have is what I call a leash timeout. I would take the leash and I attach it. Now, we have two different sized dogs here. For this dog here, if we want to pan down here on Ruby, sorry, it was an R. I would step on the leash about maybe this far away from their head, about a foot. For Gavin here, if we want to pivot to Gavin, Gavin is a much bigger dog. He's about the size of a standard lab. He's a little bit thicker. In his case, I would step on the leash about 3 feet away from his head. You can come back to me. When I do this, a lot of dogs will keep on will flop around and freak out. Don't say a word. Just stand on the leash. Eventually, all that spazzing out is a good way of burning energy. After they spaz out enough, they'll sit down. When they sit down, they'll sit as far away as the leash will allow. Dogs have what's called an oppositional reflex. They will automatically pull against a tense leash. So as soon as the dog sits down, if I leave my foot there, it's pulling against the leash. As soon as I take my foot off the leash, they feel that difference. So if the dog sits here and I'm standing on the leash with this foot, I would slide my foot over towards the dog to take the tension off of the leash after it sits down. Now after it sits down, sometimes a minute, sometimes several minutes later, it will lay down. Now let's say the leash is going right here, we'll use this. So I'm standing on the leash like this, the dog lays down, very subtly, I would take my foot off of the leash. I don't take the dog off of the leash, I don't pet the dog, and I don't tell it good job. I want it just to understand that when I'm defiant, and that's what it is, because at this point, we hissed to warn it before it broke the rule. When it broke the rule, we stood up. When it broke it again, we stood up and marched at it. When we broke it a third time, I put you on the leash timeout. So now the dog's being defiant. So the consequence is you lose all freedom. You're isolated. You have just enough room to stand or sit. As soon as you sit, I take the tension off the leash. As soon as you lay down, I take my foot off of the leash. And now the dog is free, but it's still attached to the leash. Now, we should not have the dog walking around the house with a leash attached unless it is supervised, because it could injure itself. Mm-hmm. But if a couple minutes go by and it revs back up again, as it runs by, we just step on the leash and we reapply that consequence. If a couple minutes go by and it stays calm, then we take the leash off. It's not quid pro quo. It's when I'm out of control, I get a leash timeout. Once I return to balance and I'm nice and calm, freedom is restored. Okay. These are what I call escalating consequences. These are nonverbal communication cues. The second and third one are really derived on how dogs communicate with each other. The hissing, dogs don't hiss, but like I mentioned earlier, all these other animals do, so Mother Nature's put it in the DNA. And then the last consequence, the leash timeout, a lot of people, if you watch The Dog Whisperer and some of these other programs, they talk about doing something called an alpha roll, which is you pin the dog down and restrain it until it submits. Again, that's a very abusive technique as far as I'm concerned. What I'm doing is I'm just basically restraining the dog in a limited capacity. It still can flop around and do what it wants. Now, if you have a dog that chews on a leash, get a chain leash and don't let them chew on it. And then as soon as they return to freedom, boom, right away, we take our foot off that, or not freedom, once they return to calm, then we take our foot off the leash. After enough times, they understand, if I just stay, under this level, then I don't have to worry about the leash timeout. So these are the escalating consequences I use to disagree with unwanted dog behaviors or actions.